I'm Magnus Hawthorne, and I am here today, again, to go over your questions and your letters. As an editor, I feel it's important to stress how narratives drive us and how we need to drive narratives. Let's get into it. It's another one of those tiny ones. Tiny little letter. Is it okay to mix contradictory settings? Well, typically when you have a contradictory setting, that means you have one set of ideas pitted against another set of ideas. And what's important is that regardless of if it's contradictory or nonsensical, your players do not disrupt your narrative. And in order to prevent them from doing so, you oftentimes have to drive the narrative in a direction that forces them to comply. Now, they may claim there are contradictions in your setting, or that it forces them into impossible situations in order to obey the narrative constrictions or the setting you've presented. And that's fine. It's completely fine. It's not about winning and losing. It's about the narrative. And the only way you lose Dungeons and Dragons is if your players take your narrative from you. Go ahead and have your contradictory settings. Next question. Is it okay to railroad your players? I'm sure that have taken the time that have also said something very nice about my Chuck E. Cheese commercial. Is it okay to railroad your players? The real question, is it okay to let the players be the conductor on the train of your narrative? And to that I say no. Your players are the fuel you throw into the furnace of your train. And if they don't like that, they have to understand they are, in fact, an integral part of your narrative, insofar as the train doesn't move without fuel. And it's very difficult to enlighten people to the idea that Dungeons and Dragons and similar games are a winning and losing game. And sometimes you do have to absolutely force your players' hands. And by that, I mean grab them by the wrist and shake the dice for them. So yes, railroading your players is not only perfectly valid, it'd be foolish to not do so. What's that, Susan? Susan, we're live. Susan! Susan! Sorry about that. Next question. How much background should your player characters have? Well, how much background should they have? I mean, is the question, should your players have their own background? Of course not. You made the world. You made the setting. And if they think that they can just take your game away from you and just make their own background and decide who their player is in your world and decide how they're going to change the things you've organized, then the answer is they should have no background. In fact, they shouldn't be at your table. But on that note, how much background should your characters have? As much as you have designed for them. If they are meant to be a peasant, then they are meant to be a peasant. They're not meant to be, and this goes to a larger point of why I'm against classes to begin with. I think rather than classes, they should have job titles or duties, because classes implies that they are filling a role as opposed to being designated a role, and that's really what's going on here. Is you're designating a role, and so the background is only as important as the role that they're performing for your narrative. Next question. We'll just have Mitchell do it. Oh, next question. How do you handle player deaths? Well, again, I hate to stress it every time I answer the question, but it is your narrative. And typically, the best way to handle player deaths is a celebration. And not the celebration of a player loss, but the celebration that your narrative has just elevated itself. And so player death is something you should reserve for very special moments or very honorary characters. Sometimes it's good to just kill a character to make a point. I do that regularly. Sometimes I had this one story, let me tell you. This guy had the audacity to try and roll initiative before I announced combat had started, and take it upon himself to initiate combat. And so he did meet a swift death. There were no dice rolls. There was some screaming. No, I didn't start the screaming. But what's important to know from that character death is that that definitely elevated my story. And it elevated my story by removing a bad player. So typically, player death is handled with a small celebration. It's more of a thank you for making my story better. But in the hands of a DM who knows what they're doing, player death is also a means to an end. And so you should always handle player death as it is what it is, insofar as it's only going to improve your game. Next question. Oh, this is an important one. How much power do you give your players? How much do you trust your players? That's really what this question is asking. How much do you trust your players? You never give your players any more power than you trust them with. And so if you have players who perhaps take it upon themselves to make decisions on their own, use magic items that might change the narrative, cast spells that are going to defeat an enemy you hadn't planned to be defeated, those are players you don't want to give any power to. And again, those could be considered disruptive players. Disruptive players, as I've said earlier, need to be emasculated. And so it's less about how much power do you give the players, and it's more about how much do you trust your players. Right? You can assign the character a level of power fit for the amount of trust you can invest in that player to not disrupt your narrative. Yeah, so it's not how much power do you give the player, it's how much do you trust the player. Mitchell. No, I don't want a donut. We're live. Well, thank you for your time. I'm Magnus Hawthorne. And remember, like, subscribe, and leave comments for me below. Send me messages, and maybe I can answer your very important questions as an editor, as a dungeon master, and as a friend.